The only possible response to that introduction is go Packers, I think. Yeah. So, hold on while I set up the smartphone so I don't run out of time, because those who know me well know that I always run out of time. Some time ago, let's see. Oh, I know you'll tell me when I have 5 minutes left, but I need a lot more warning than that. So, some time ago, I was starting to do environmental seminars, and felt like the 20 minutes or 30 minutes or even 45 minutes that I was usually given was just enough time to frustrate the audience and me, because the topic is so large and so complicated, and in many cases so political. So I thought, I can solve this problem. I'll design a weekend seminar, which allows me to be on the platform talking to people for 5 hours. And I still go over time and run out of time. But at least people are a little bit less frustrated, I think, with the content we're able to deliver. No, I'm not going to keep us here for 5 hours. I'm very pleased to be here. I've been connected with Echo for a long time, since back about 2002 when I first started coming. I was at that time working with Au Sable Institute, and we worked with Martin Price and his staff at that time to set up a missionary earthcaping course to try to train potential missionaries in conservation concepts that would connect with missionary principles. And that course ran for a number of years. I don't think it's still going any longer, but that was my first introduction. I've been coming back and forth occasionally ever since. It's normally the best place where I can meet and have a decent conversation with my brother Stan, who is here somewhere. Stan Brown, some of you know him, who's also been coming back and forth to Echo. He's one of my little brothers. I'm his only oldest brother, so you can figure out how the family works in that point. He and I discovered some years ago that we were competing for the affections of the same funder. He had been supported with his work in Central Asia by this funder for some time. I found this funder independently without having any idea that they were working with Stan. They gave us a very nice grant, as they had been doing for Stan for some time. Neither of us, you can tell how much this family communicates, neither of us had told anything to the other. And of course, because it's money, we weren't about to anyway. So one day Stan is in their office and he sees a report that says Care of Creation on it. He says, "Oh, do you guys support Care of Creation?" And the executive director said, "Yeah, do you know them?" And he says, "Yeah, that's my brother." So, not sure what else to say about that, but I appreciate what Stan and Tammy have been able to do for many years in Kazakhstan. Now, to begin our conversation here, I always start with a little cartoon to lighten things up. This is, I show this one on me. It's a couple of cartoon animals discussing one of the issues of the day. After much study, I've determined the cause of global warming. And what is that? Idiots the world over spouting their worthless opinions. The excessive hot air is killing us. Before you retort, consider the environmental consequences. So here I am, having burned a whole bunch of CO2 to be here, to try and persuade you, not that I'm going to talk much or anything about climate change, but to help all of us to maybe understand a little bit about the problems of the environmental crisis in general. And I have probably abused the environment in order to be here and do that. So often when I'm talking to people, and I've flown halfway around the world to talk about something like climate change, I'll say, "How are we going to solve this problem?" Well, if just one of you takes one less trip in the next year, you've canceled out my trip to come here, and we're even. If two of you take one less trip, then we're ahead of the game. So, now, a little bit about my organizational background, because it will fit into what we want to share today. care of creation, pursuing a God-centered response to the environmental crisis, or another tagline we use is mobilizing the worldwide church to respond to the environmental crisis. We started in 2005 after I had been working with Ensemble Institute and Cal DeWitt, whose name some of you may know, for about 5 years. We could say that I spent 5 years as Cal's number 2, having breakfast with him almost every week, and though I was simply a pastor and an English major, you can't have breakfast with Cal every week almost for 5 years without learning something. So having been downsized from Ensemble because of the organization was shrinking a bit, I got connected with Craig Sorley in Kenya, who was looking for some way to pursue what he was at that time calling environmental missions, something that we knew a few other people who were doing, trying to put environment and missions and evangelical all together. He couldn't find an organization at that time that understood this concept. So Craig says to me, "You need a job, I need an organization, why don't we get together and you can direct it?" And I'm thinking, I'm over 50, I have 3 kids who have to go to college, I have a wife who can't work, there's no money, and you want to put together an impossible combination of environment, evangelical, and missions. Let's find someone else to do it. Well, you can see how that job ended. So we started with the work in Kenya, Craig's project, which I'll come back to again in a minute. We've recently starting a work in Tanzania, and I handle the U.S. end of the thing and find myself working in amazing parts of the world that, again, I'll come back to in a second. This is Craig. As was mentioned, he's one of the alumni of the internship program here. Many of you know him. He has, I think, spoken once or twice at the conference. And has become quite a East African expert in what we're still calling farming God's way, foundations for farming. We like the phrase because it speaks African faith language, and our farmers there just love the concept of God's field and God's blanket and that sort of thing. You can see this was one of our early maize crop attempts. And the lesson here is if you want the maize to look really good, put your little kids in the picture. Since then, that was done at that project site was Brackenhurst Conference Center. We've since moved to Kajabi, where we have a site on the campus of Moffat Bible College. And Craig has done a lot of work with ongoing control plots. You can see this here where he's got 2 sets for everything. So he'll plant conventional maize in one and farming God's way maize in the other, conventional beans and farming God's way beans and so on. Whenever it's time for harvest, he arranges a farmer training and I was there for one of these, gets the farmers together and let's discuss these 2 fields, this corn and this corn, what's the difference? And I was listening to this, different seed, no. You use more fertilizer, no. Well, you watered this one, no. Everything's the same, planted the same seed, same date, same everything. And then they do the harvest themselves, and then they do a public weighing, and then calculate out how much the yield would be per hectare and that sort of thing. So remarkable program, and our specialty is turning out to be training other organizations. So we have people from other NGOs around Kenya and East Africa coming in for regular trainings. That's what we feel our niche is going to be in East Africa, is providing this service for others, perhaps like some of you folks. Now, the global thing is really fascinating. Some years ago, we were going to Urbana. I was doing the environmental seminar there. 4 days, 20,000 students, 1 hour for creation care. So we figured we had to make the best of it. And I thought, well, Urbana, at that time, our mission statement said to mobilize the church to respond to the environmental crisis. And I thought, well, Urbana is about the world. Urbana is about missions. Let's insert worldwide. We're going to mobilize the worldwide church. It makes us sound more relevant. It was purely advertising copy. At that time, besides Kenya and some seminars in the U.S., there was no way anyone could have looked at us and said, "You're mobilizing the worldwide church." Unfortunately, God heard, apparently. And through a number of circumstances I don't have time to get into, we've connected with the Lausanne movement that many of you are or should be familiar with, a network of evangelicals around the world started by Billy Graham and John Stott and so on. I was able to go to the big Cape Town meeting in 2010 and gave one of the smaller presentations there. But more importantly, connected with many of the top leadership at Lausanne. The end result of this whole process has been a series of meetings and the conferences that were mentioned. Now, one of the things that came out of the Cape Town commitment, which if you're familiar with the process, all the big Lausanne meetings, which happen about every 15 years, have produced major significant documents for the global church. The Lausanne Covenant is still used as a de facto evangelical statement of faith by organizations all over the world. The Manila Manifesto from the Manila meeting in whatever year it was is considered to have laid the groundwork for the present the present tendency to our desire of churches in America and in the West to partner directly with churches in other countries. It was a partnership kind of document. Out of Cape Town came the Cape Town Commitment, which is written in the language of a confession of love to God. It was written by Chris Wright, who's I consider him the successor to John Stott. In the Cape Town Commitment, we have some of the strongest language on creation care or Christians being involved in environment than we've ever seen in any public document. And as creation care advocates, we have often felt like we're the sort of forgotten stepchild in the corner. Yeah, you guys are doing good work, but what you're doing isn't anywhere near as important as saving souls or even feeding the hungry. And we keep thinking to ourselves, well, you know, if you don't fix the environment, you're not going to have food to feed the hungry. But the Cape Town Commitment seems to have changed that. And this is the relevant paragraph. Cape Town Commitment's available online. Just Google Cape Town Commitment PDF, and you can get the document, download it. The earth is created, sustained, redeemed by Christ. We cannot claim to love God while abusing what belongs to Christ by right of creation, redemption, and inheritance. We care for the earth and responsibly use its abundant resources, not according to the rationale of the secular world, but for the Lord's sake. If Jesus is Lord of all the earth, we cannot separate our relationship to Christ from how we act in relation to the earth. For to proclaim the gospel that says Jesus is Lord is to proclaim the gospel that includes the earth, since Christ's lordship is over all creation. Creation care is thus a gospel issue within the lordship of Jesus Christ. Now, many of you, I suspect, working overseas in other countries have very little question that the environment is degraded, that we have serious issues to deal with. Whatever your feelings might be on issues that people argue about, like climate change, for example. I'm not touching climate change this morning. I'm happy to get into it in the Meet the Speaker session this afternoon if anyone wants to find out why someone like me feels the way I do. What this statement does for the church in America in particular is removes the politics and helps us to see that creation care is not a political issue, not an economic issue, not something to be kicked back and forth by governments. It's a faith issue. It's a gospel issue. Because as this document says, if we are to submit to the lordship of Christ and Christ created creation and put it under our care, then we have a responsibility to care for it. Now, recognizing that creation care is not without controversy, the Lausanne folks came to me in 2011 and said, we'd like you to organize a global consultation on creation care and the gospel. We gathered about 50 people in Jamaica a year ago in order to discuss the whole question of creation care and the gospel. Stan Dorr and his wife were honored guests, and we were pleased to have them. And many other people from the U.S. and from many other countries. We spent 4 days together. Not coincidentally, I think, as I opened the session, Superstorm Sandy was attacking New York City and New Jersey at that very hour. It was amazing. There were a number of people who weren't able to get to the conference on time because they were stuck in airports and so on. The bishop from the Philippines spent about 3 days trying to get down to Jamaica. He was in New Jersey. His flight was canceled. He emailed me. He said, I'm going to drive to Philadelphia. And drive to Pittsburgh. So he got on the road to Pittsburgh, discovered the highway was closed, and then arranged for a flight out of Albany and had a friend who drove him all the way to Albany in order to get down to Jamaica, and spent 24 hours with us before he had to leave for Manila to go back and do a wedding. So the bride was not willing to change the date in spite of my best efforts. But it was a great meeting. And this meeting produced a significant document, the Jamaica Call to Action, that I would encourage you to go online and take a look at. You can sign it online. It's online in 6 languages, or maybe 7, I can't remember. We'll have copies of this at the afternoon session today. 10 calls from simple lifestyle to theology to sustainable food production. It's remarkably comprehensive. But what's important is not the specific calls. It's based on 2 convictions. That creation care is indeed a gospel issue, and this phrase I love. I didn't write it, but I love it. We would care for creation even if it were not in crisis. Very often, especially in the secular world, among the secular environmentalists, the environmental movement is driven by a negative sense that we have to save ourselves. And what we're saying here is what we see in Scripture is that no, even if creation were not in crisis, we as His people are called to take care of it and to do what we can to help it to flourish. And this, in fact, is perhaps our first connection with you folks who are farmers and working with farmers, is that's your job, is to help people to get these poor, tired, degraded fields to flourish again. This is a sacred task. It's what we're called to do. And even if there were no crisis, this would be job number 1. It's the first job that we were given in the Garden of Eden itself. But our second conviction, we are faced with a crisis that is pressing, urgent, and that must be resolved in our generation. Now, I would love to have the time to support that statement this morning and to give you discussion from population to globalization to water shortages to the degradation of farmland. But you all know that. And in fact, I heard a part of Stan's talk on the Brown Revolution a couple of nights ago where he touched on some of this. The amount of farmland that we're losing is shocking at the very time when we know from the population curve that we're going to have vastly greater amounts of food in the world in the next 20, 30 years. We're losing farmland every year. What are we going to do? The people at World Vision are terrified. They have they're big. They're looking long term. They don't know how we're going to solve this problem. Governments don't know. So we're faced with a crisis, and we've got to figure out what we're going to do about it. Now, there's again the website if you'd like to go on later, of course, to sign the document. Now, one of the advantages I occasionally pull from having written a book is that I can quote myself. I know that the entire talk is quoting myself, but this particular paragraph I'd like to call to your attention. And this, incidentally, ties directly in with Robin's talk this morning, a number of mentions of the importance of the church. And in fact, Robin, I meant to say this earlier, but thank you for your talk. And as people listen to this, they're going to think that these 2 talks were planned to be together for months and months and months. And instead, I was actually supposed to be in California this week, and must be something about the sovereignty of God. I'm not sure. But anyway, the paragraph. The environmental crisis is a scientific problem, an economic problem, a political problem, a security problem, and a moral problem. A matter of life and death for millions, but at its root, it's a spiritual problem. We often use the phrase in our organization, environmental problems are sin problems. And we're going to use the boxes here to demonstrate that in a couple of minutes. If it's a spiritual problem, there's only one answer. The church, properly understood and functioning in the full power of God, is the only institution or organization available to the human race that can address a problem with this many dimensions. This is why I do what I do. This is what our organization, Care of Creation, is all about, and what we're trying to help the rest of the Christian environmental movement, the creation care movement, to focus on is that it's the church that is going to answer this. It's not governments. It's not NGOs. It's going to have to be the original NGO, which is the church, or we're not going to solve the problem, because there's only one solution to sin, and that's Jesus. And there's only one way the world is going to hear about Jesus, and that's through the church. So that's very quickly what the care of creation side of the creation care side of the argument is all about. But what does all of that have to do with what you all have been talking about all week? Moringa, neem, urban gardening, green revolutions, brown revolutions, FFF, FGW, CFAT, KP, QRST. This is just to prove to Stan that I've been listening. I have no idea what any of it means. No, I have some idea of, I have been listening carefully enough, but this is a technical conference. You guys are here appropriately to talk to each other about what works and what doesn't work in your fields, in your projects, with your staff. So what's that have to do with creation care in the bigger picture? Well, let's step back a bit. Oh dear, we've got some formatting problems going from one computer to another. Well, the enviros, that's my tribe, creation care. Over here, let's put the agros. That's you guys, people involved in agriculture. Down in this other corner, we can put the sojos, the social justice people. Over here, we'll put the BAMs, the businesses mission people. And we could throw some devos in, you know, the development folks and so on. We're all guilty of something that this isn't original to me. It's I call it the hammer syndrome. You've heard this proverb. When you're a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. And you've sat through presentations like that. Well, someone will come up with, his idea is wells. And every problem in Africa can be solved with wells. Or another guy has a solution to infant diarrhea, and every possible problem can be solved if people will only buy this solution to infant diarrhea. Now, that's understandable. I mean, I find myself doing it. In fact, as I was getting ready to come here, my wife said, so what's the name of your, what are you going to be talking about? And I said, well, this is the title. And I said, but, you know, it's always almost the same talk. You just change the title and you give the same talk, which is how some people sell books. You know how these big pastors, how they sell so many books, they just change the title. So don't bother to buy them. just read the last one over again. Well, it turned out that this is not at all the same talk as I've given before, partly because of me being around you guys for a couple of days and you know, getting the input and so on. But I'm guilty of it. You know, if the entire church would only listen to me, all your problems would be solved. And but I have been sort of navigating these waters for, well, I first came into creation care in 2000, so 13, 14 years. But I've been watching the world of missions and environmental aid efforts and so on longer than that. I've seen something very interesting happening. We're all converging. We're all using similar language. Sustainability, community, biodiversity, social justice, Christian worldview, integral mission. We could probably pause and give an entire session just on this list. What I think I see happening is that as those of us who are trying to stay away from the hammer syndrome, start to realize, for example, just from the world of environment, there are people who are starting to say, yes, capitalism is evil, but we're not going to solve these problems without some market devices to help to allocate resources. So maybe capitalism as we practice it is evil, but the instrument of the market is something useful that we can use. See this even coming from secular environmentalists. The common criticism from the Christian world of radical environmentalism in particular has been they're anti-people, they're anti-human. And you can still find a few that have a very biblical view of humanity. That is, that human beings are a scourge on the earth, which is what the Bible says, isn't it? All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. I mean, we're a scum on the earth, and the radical environmentalists are absolutely right. Without Jesus. But more and more, even secular environmentalists are starting to see that environment isn't about polar bears, it's about people. And if we don't solve the people problem, we won't solve the environment problem. And the social justice people, yes, they're passionate about human trafficking and slavery, but they're beginning to understand that at the root of poverty often are environmental issues or economic issues or food security issues. And you folks, I'm very impressed with how over the last 10 or 12 years, more and more I'm hearing from Echo and other similar organizations, more and more concern about soil health and conservation, and we've got to take care of this place if it's going to take care of us. We cannot solve the world's hunger problem simply by dumping fertilizer anymore, as we perhaps thought at one point we might be able to do. The BAMs, the business as mission people, those are the money grubbers that I want to meet more of, because they want to make profit. But they also are starting to talk about a quadruple bottom line. Profit, people, planet, and kingdom. There's another P that I've forgotten exactly how they do it. So what's going on here? There's a phrase in my second book, When Heaven and Nature Sing, that I took from the Farming God's Way program. Farming God's Way essentially is, let's see if we can run our farms the way God would have us run them, and maybe things will go better for us. And I thought if it works for farms, maybe it would work for the whole world. So how about running the world God's way? That's what that second book is about. In effect, what we're trying to do is we're all working toward shalom. These are the connections, I think, between all of these different efforts. But how does it work, especially theologically? I want to switch over to the table here and talk a bit about relationships. These are not pizza boxes. I always wanted to see what it looked like on 4 screens at once. We have God. Let's see. Put a reading up. Self. Others. And creation. Now, the idea of a matrix of relationships is not strictly new to me. John Stott uses it, Chris Wright uses it, some of the others use it, although they'll often talk about 3 relationships: God, other people, and creation. Particularly, you saw that even in the Cape Town commitment paragraph, in terms of the relationships that God had in mind when he created us in the first place. Relationship with God, relationship with other people, relationship with the rest of creation. It's used often to justify or to explain why this relationship to creation is important to God and therefore should be important to us. Now, I've expanded this concept a bit by adding a 4th relationship, the relationship with myself. That may be partly because I come from the baby boomer generation here in the U.S. I'm a child of the 60s, and we were the original generation that lost ourselves and had to go to places like India to find ourselves. So, but I do really think that even for young people today, there's a sense in which when I'm out of sorts, I have a broken relationship with myself. So, okay, so anyways, that's why we've got the 4 relationships. I want to go through and explain how this explains how things are wrong in the world and how Jesus makes them right, and how it applies not just to creation care, but probably to the work that most of you are doing. We can go right back to Genesis chapter 3, where the fall is explained, very briefly, since you all know the story. Eve and the serpent in the garden. The serpent says, is it true that God said you can't eat? And she says, yeah, well, we can eat anything we want except the one tree in the middle of the garden, which, we Americans think it's an apple. I have it on good evidence that the fruit on the tree in the garden was a mango. How do you know that? Well, because you can't eat a mango without getting the evidence all over yourself. So anyway, serpent said, she looked, she ate, she gave to Adam, he ate, and the first relationship bites the dust. Okay? God comes to have his apparently regular evening chat with Adam in the garden in the cool of the day, and Adam is hiding. Why are you hiding? Because I was naked and I was ashamed. This creature that has been completely at peace with himself up until now suddenly finds that he's guilty. He's got shame. He's got self-esteem issues. He is no longer at peace with himself. His relationship with himself is broken. God says, what happened? Did you eat the fruit that I told you not to eat? And now we have the first marriage argument in all of history. The woman you gave me, she did it. A broken person can't face his God, and so he blames the other person. Relationship with other people is broken. Now, if we jump to the end of the story, because of what you've done, you're cursed, the ground is cursed. You have to leave the garden, and you're going to have to grow your own food instead of just pulling it off the trees. And you're going to have to deal with thorns and thistles and mosquitoes and malaria and all the rest of it. 4 broken relationships. But what I want you to understand is that they actually broke like this. They caused each other to break. Broken relationship with God. A person who is designed to be in fellowship with God cannot possibly be at peace with himself because of this broken relationship, and so he's broken. 2 people who are both broken can't possibly live together in peace. Their relationship is broken. And a whole community of broken people can't be at peace with the world around them. This, in a nutshell, is how I think of the fall, and it explains a lot. Yesterday we heard Keith, our other brother from Wisconsin, I'm from Madison, Wisconsin, said that he at times felt like he was fighting against nature. Well, yeah, we feel like we're fighting against nature because nature's fighting against us because our relationship has been broken. So if that explains sin and the fall, it also explains what true redemption is. We come to Christ. Our sins are forgiven. Our relationship with God is restored. Call that theologically regeneration. As the Holy Spirit begins to work in us, sanctification begins to take place. We begin to deal with our sin, with our shame, with our guilt, with our baggage. Relationship to self begins to be restored. Now notice, this happens right away. This is a lifelong process, but it's happening. And as we begin to be healed inside and we develop our relationship with God, we find that it's possible to have genuine relationships with other people, and we can have genuine community. If this is regeneration, this is sanctification, we can call this koinonia. the fellowship that happens in the church. Now let's pause here. This is the evangelical gospel, these three. But if Jesus died to cure the effects of all of our sin, what about this one? See, what I'm arguing for, what we're arguing for, is full redemption. And this is what I think is spelled out in the Cape Town Commitment. This is what it means for creation care to be a gospel issue, is that the effects of the gospel cover all these dimensions of our lives. Now, the domino concept is very important. So there's something about dominoes. They have to be put up in the order in which they fell. We have lots of people in the world who are working in agriculture or environment, but they're pushing up against broken communities, as in conflict zones. And it's hard. And there are people working in communities, the social justice people. But they're being pulled down by a broken environment, and they're pushing up against broken people, because these communities are full of broken people. And there are people who are working in personal counseling all over the world who desperately want to heal people, but they're pushing up against a broken relationship with God. See, this is why we need the church. This is why we need it to be a fully dimensioned effort, because it's all got to go together. In forums like Lausanne and other places, you often hear arguments about social gospel, spiritual gospel. Is it going to be one or the other? No. It's all the same process. And so how do creation care and farming and social justice and business's mission, how do they tie together? Through this relationship paradigm. We're about restoring relationships. We can go back to the PowerPoint now. Colossians 1:19 and 20 is my theme verse. Redemption, well, let me read it real quick. Should have put it on the screen, Modern people don't know how to turn pages anymore. Colossians 1:15 to 20 is a wonderful hymn of praise to Christ. Paul says he's the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. By him all things were created, things in heaven and things on earth, etc., etc. All things were created by him and for him. And then you get down to 19 and 20. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, that's Jesus, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. What Paul is saying is that redemption must be comprehensive, or it's not redemption. We have to believe, and we have to preach a gospel that includes not just human salvation, but human salvation as a centerpiece in God's plan to restore all of creation that has been stained by our sin. And then we can add one more to this. If Colossians 1 says redemption must be comprehensive, Romans chapter 8, verses 19 to 22 says redemption is in fact comprehensive, because the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed, for the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of the children of God. That's a promise to non-human creation, that non-human creation will be blessed because of human salvation. You see this happen when you work with Christian farmers who take their Bible study and learn to apply it in terms of the discipline with which they work their fields and the care with which they care for their animals, and the fact that now this farm is beautiful and is flourishing, and in fact they have more food to eat. Creation is groaning in anticipation that creation will rejoice when we rejoice, assuming we understand what salvation really is all about. Okay, very quickly. Thank you. How can we apply this paradigm to all of our or your very different projects? Let me suggest 3 things. Good theology. Yes, it's going to be frustrating. It is frustrating, I know it is, to be planting those seeds for the 150th time and to feel like we are fighting against nature itself. Reminding ourselves and reminding our staff that both the challenges and the promises are part of a bigger plan that we understand and that we can remind each other of. That there is a reason why those weeds are growing. There's a reason why we have staff fights. There is a reason why nothing is easy. But that there is equally reasons for hope. Because we understand that relationships are being restored. I think good theology, a perspective of what I call this full redemption idea is critically important to keep us going through the hard times, but also perhaps to keep us humble during the good times. Because we will have those good times, and I'm pretty sure they won't last based on my own experience. But second principle is sound science. This is where my side and Echo's comes together. One of the principles that we teach in creation care is that God speaks to us in 2 ways. He speaks to us through His written word, and He speaks to us through His physical world. A theologian interprets the written word, a scientist interprets the physical world. Both are God's truth. And we have to be sure that we understand God's physical world properly before we start fiddling around with it. We have to be sure before we put on those wells that the groundwater is what we think it is and that it's going to last and so on. We have to be sure that we are introducing good new crops and not one more invasive species. We have to be sure that the fertilizer that we think is a fantastic idea really is a fantastic idea and not just someone trying to sell us something. Good science. And I love it that Echo has been here for so many years and continue to commend them and you guys for wanting to be here so you can be doing your work to the highest scientific standards possible. And let's do what we can to communicate to our brothers and sisters outside these walls that science isn't evil, that science is God's instrument that He's given to us, used properly, of course. But and I would also encourage you probably figured this out anyway, that besides Echo, there's lots of Christian professors, both in Christian and in secular universities. Some of them even have research money and are looking for places to spend it. So maybe you can help them to spend it on your particular project and get some help them and get some good out of it as well. And a lot of prayer. One of the things I know that I'm guilty of in my organization, and I suspect 1 or 2 of you might be, and that's not praying nearly as much as we should. If we were out church planting or doing evangelism, we would not leave the door without praying and holding hands and asking God's blessing, God's protection. But we're just planting trees, so we just charge out and do it. Those trees need as much prayer as the other stuff. The call to action concludes with, I think, one of my favorite paragraphs, and it's tremendously important. Having tasted of the grace and mercies of God in Christ Jesus, and through the Holy Spirit and with hope in the fullness of our redemption, we pray with confidence that the triune God can heal our land and all who dwell in it for the glory of His matchless name. We are engaged in a spiritual battle. You are. It may not feel like it. Well, those of you working in conflict zones, you know it. But even the rest of us, these are not simply technical challenges of why the weeds are growing. Satan does not want us to succeed in helping God's creation to go green again, and he is going to stop us with everything that he's going to try to stop us. He won't succeed. But we need to remember that that's an important dimension of what we're doing. Okay, real quickly, other things you might do if you'd like to become aware of what's happening with this series of global conferences. Sign on to the Jamaica Call to Action, lausanne.org/creationcare. If You sign your name, you will be part of the mailing list where we tell people. The Global Creation Care Campaign is coming to a country near you. I guarantee it. Regional conferences through 2016, beginning with Southeast Asia this next March. If you're from Southeast Asia, then we're focusing this on all the ASEAN nations plus Hong Kong and Taiwan, I think. And you have not heard about this conference and want an invitation, or especially know some local folks who would like to be invited, please talk to me this afternoon or after the talk this morning. East and Central Africa will be a year from now in October and November next year. After that, we're looking at Latin America, North America, other places. You can pray that the funding will come through for these. This is about a $400,000 project over the 3 years, but the initial response has been encouraging. My smartphone beat you. It wasn't supposed to be, but anyway. Yeah, so we're excited about this. We appreciate your prayers for it. Books available in the bookstore, Our Father's World and When Heaven and Nature Sing. And that's my information I'll leave up for a second. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.